Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. To begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and to work on this land. Today's webinar is hosted by the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. We are a vibrant intellectual community that is home to a diverse range of ideas and approaches. The faculty stature is one of the very best law schools in the world, rests on the excellence and diversity of our faculty, robust clinics and centers, and the caliber of our students. The excellence of our law school is due in no small part to the deans that we've had over the years, and we're delighted to have University Professor Emeritus Martin Friedland share with us today the fascinating account that led to his new book, W.P.M. Kennedy, The Biography of an Enigma. Kennedy came to Canada in 1913 and retired as U of T's law school dean in 1949 without having taken a single course in law. Marty is remarkably well placed to have written this book. For one, he's a foremost historian as well as a legal thinker, and he's known for many important works that have a historical nature, including the incredible piece, The History of the University of Toronto. His university professorship, which is the highest honor the university can confer on one of its professors, his university professorship speaks to his prominence in the academy. As I've said to him in the past, he was a multidisciplinary legal scholar before it was in vogue to be such a thing. Indeed, he was one of the inventors of the idea of being a multidisciplinary legal scholar. But in addition, as I said earlier about us all owing a debt to the deans that came before for the quality of the faculty, Marty can relate to W.P.M. Kennedy in another important way, in that he served as dean of the Faculty of Law from 1972 to 1979. He was either the third dean of the faculty, depending on when, whether the creation of the faculty at the university counts, or he was the fourth dean if one counted the work of W.P.M. Kennedy that came before the law school formally became a faculty. Marty, I am sure, would definitely say that he is the fourth dean to have served at the fourth law dean at the University of Toronto. But for many in the audience today, I know, including me, Marty is more than all this. He's also a fondly remembered professor. So we're delighted, Marty. Thank you for doing this, and I will turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Ed, for that generous introduction. It's a pleasure being here with all of you, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about searching for W.P.M. Kennedy. As you'll see from my talk, I thoroughly enjoyed writing the book. The Kennedy story is another story of the twists and turns of life. W.P.M. Kennedy, as Ed just said, became the Dean of Law, yet he never took a single course in law. One particular turn that we will come to shortly is that his first wife died in 1919 from the Spanish flu, which indirectly affected Kennedy's future career. But first, how did I come to write the book? In 2013, I was asked by Oxford University Press to do an introductory essay for the republication of Kennedy's classic text, The Constitution of Canada. I said, yes, I'd do it. I was interested in Kennedy. We had both been law deans. He was the first dean of law at the University of Toronto. As Ed said, I was the fourth dean. We're about to choose our 11th dean. Although Kennedy was alive while I was a law student, I never met him. But I knew from my work on the U of T history that Kennedy was a fascinating character. He was a major scholar, and by the end of the 1920s had written 10 books. He was also a sparkling teacher. J.J. Robinette, one of Canada's greatest lawyers, who had been taught by Kennedy in the 1920s, recalled that Kennedy was one of those brilliant Irishmen who could dazzle you, a performer as much as a teacher. I liked the 1920s. 1922, the date that Kennedy's book came out, is a key date in the history of the university. It was the year of the discovery of insulin and the year of the creation of the School of Graduate Studies. The combination of the two, many would argue, was the turning point in Toronto becoming the leading university in Canada. By chance, I had a personal connection with Kennedy. In 1983, my wife and I bought the Kennedy Cottage just west of Algonquin Park and north of Huntsville that they had purchased in 1940. It still looks exactly the same today, except there's a new structure on the back of the main cottage. The Kennedys, like many academics in those years, would spend at least 4 months at the cottage. There were 2 trunkfuls of letters left at the cottage. Their son, Freer, who sold us the cottage, obviously knew the papers were there, but never mentioned them at the time. Some years later, he suggested that I write a biography of his father. I said I might consider it. The cottage played a role in creating the present law school. In 1945, Caesar Wright, then a professor and later the dean of Osgoode Hall Law School, and his good friend, Sidney Smith, the president of the University of Toronto, cooked up a scheme whereby Borel Askin would leave the U of T and join Osgoode, and at some future time, Wright and Laskin and perhaps others would leave Osgoode to form a new professional law school at the University of Toronto. This would replace Kennedy's undergraduate honor law course. They wanted Kennedy's blessing, and so Wright and Laskin came up to the cottage that summer to pitch the scheme to Kennedy. Kennedy did not want to lose Laskin, but could see some merit in the proposal. Laskin did, in fact, leave for Osgoode and return to the U of T with Caesar Wright and John Willis in 1949 to establish the present law school. I must say, I keep the trail that they walked on beside the lake carefully groomed. After I finished my introductory essay, the question arose whether I should do a full biography. Kennedy had destroyed his personal papers in Toronto when he retired. Would there be enough material, apart from the letters at the cottage and some official law school papers, to do a full biography? Kennedy had not written his memoirs, so I had to construct his life on my own, hence the title, Searching for W.P.M. Kennedy. Fortunately, there was Kennedy correspondence in many archival collections. There was, for example, a large number of letters in the papers of Presidents Faulkner and Cody, and about 100 letters in the Mackenzie King papers. I start the book with Kennedy coming from Ireland to Canada in 1913 at age 34. He came to St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, a Catholic institution, and taught English and history. He'd grown up in Northern Ireland as a Presbyterian, attended Trinity College, Dublin, becoming an Anglican, and then in his 20s, converted to Catholicism. He was a great hit with the students at St. Francis Xavier, but was dismissed because he had a serious romantic relationship with the student, Sarah Josephine Cameron, and even dedicated a book he published that year to her to, quote, S.J.C. Her family was against the relationship, and Sarah's uncle, as it turned out, was the Bishop of Antigonish. The rector of the college was happy to see Kennedy go. Sarah never married, and I don't know whether she had any further contact with Kennedy. Kennedy was invited to come to St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. He was invited by the Archbishop of Toronto, Neil McNeill, the former head of St. Francis Xavier. 6 months later, in spite of having been kicked out of St. Francis Xavier, Kennedy wrote to the rector about getting an honorary degree from the university. The rector wrote back, "I have discussed with some members of the faculty your application for the degree of LLD, and from the views they expressed, I am led to believe that a resolution in favor of granting you an LLD would not carry at a faculty meeting." Kennedy did, however, get such a degree based on his previous scholarship from Trinity College, Dublin. He was a popular teacher at St. Michael's, again teaching English and history. He continued his scholarship. Father McCorkle, a colleague and later the president of St. Michael's, said in an oral interview, "I liked him personally a lot, and I think we all did." But he added, "It was hard to discover his true background. He boasted about so many things that people figured that he had to have lived 100 years to do all the things that he said he did." Here is a very brief look at Kennedy's early life. He was born in Northern Ireland in 1879. His father was a Presbyterian minister, and Kennedy had 8 sisters. He became estranged from his family. He claimed that his schooling was on the continent. His who's who entries over the years state private tuition, Paris, Vienna, and Berlin. It is clear, however, that he attended high school in Northern Ireland, but later kept his association with Northern Ireland a secret. When he died in 1963, all the obituaries said that he was born in Dublin. But I have his birth certificate showing that he was born in Lurgan in Northern Ireland. He was obviously trying to hide his Northern and Presbyterian roots. No doubt this was because he came to Canada as a Catholic, and his ancestors on both sides were staunchly anti-Catholic. One had even been charged with murder in the early 1800s during one of the frequent clashes between Catholics and Protestants. Kennedy had been an excellent student at Trinity College, Dublin. He won many prizes. He claimed that after Trinity College, Dublin, he studied with the great historian William Stubbs at Oxford. But did he? If he did, it couldn't have been for long because Stubbs was ill that fall and died in the spring. The U of T calendars from 1914 to 1963, however, have this entry, quote, M.A. Dublin, Oxon, end of quote. This certainly suggests an Oxford M.A., but there is no record at Oxford of any degree from Oxford. For the first 10 years after graduating from Trinity College, Dublin, he wrote about Tudor ecclesiastical history. At that point, he was an Anglican. He authored or co-authored a number of significant books in England, including a book on Bishop Parker, Queen Elizabeth's priests. priest, and other works using church records from the 16th century. He was interested in primary historical records, which carried over to his later legal studies, such as one of his first books at the U of T, a book of documents on the Canadian Constitution. He spent a number of years at an Anglican monastery near Leeds, and while there became a Catholic at about that time. It is not surprising that St. Michael's wanted him because of his significant scholarship. St. Michael's was hoping to become, and indeed later became, a major center of Catholic scholarship. He married in 1915, and he and Teresa had 2 children. He needed money. St. Mike's did not pay well, and so in addition to his St. Michael's teaching, he started teaching English at University College. He was given an office at University College, Cloisters. Then he added teaching constitutional history in the history department, where he became interested in Canadian constitutional history. Canadian constitutional history was then being taught in the Department of Political Economy by Henry Lefroy, an important person in the Kennedy story. Kennedy worked closely with him for a number of years and did an historical introduction to one of Lefroy's books, a short treatise on Canadian constitutional law. Kennedy's involvement with Lefroy was Kennedy's entire legal education. Lefroy died in 1919, and Kennedy started teaching Canadian constitutional history in the history department. He was active on the U of T campus, supporting women's suffrage, women authors, and the hiring of women, and after he left Catholicism, family planning. He became friendly with important people, such as President Robert Faulkner, Edmund Walker, the chair of the board, and President Henry Cody. This was a lifelong pattern. He claimed that every prime minister was his friend, and maybe they were. The Spanish influenza arrived in 1918 and returned in 1919. Because of its relevance today, I'm going to read part of what I wrote in the book. Quote, on Sunday, April the 13th, 1919, Kennedy's wife, Teresa, died at the age of 26 from the Spanish flu. 50,000 Canadians died of the flu, often an agonizing death, and a disproportionate number of them were women in their 20s. Teresa's death certificate shows that, as was common in the case of the Spanish flu, she died of pneumonia, having had influenza for only 24 hours. Kennedy's 2 young children, both under 2 years old, were also infected. A week after his wife's death, Kennedy wrote to the chair of political economy, James Mavor, thanking him for his sympathy and adding, yes, we are fighting night and day for the lives of my 2 kiddies, Gilbert and Beatrice. Poor things, they are still in danger, and we can only face each hour like flint. Teresa was buried in a mass grave at Mount Pleasant Cemetery. The children recovered. His eldest son, Gilbert, a graduate of the law school, who became the Deputy Minister of Justice in British Columbia, believed that his influenza seriously affected his health. He later lost his spleen and suffered from epilepsy. Beatrice, the second child, was later institutionalized because of mental illness. A little over a year later, Kennedy married one of his students, Pauline Simpson. She never graduated. George Wrong, the head of history, was angry about Kennedy's relationship with a student and wanted him out of his department. Kennedy, now an agnostic, had severed his ties with St. Michael's. Kennedy applied to Dalhousie University and other universities, as well as to the Federal and Ontario archives. No luck. Fortunately, the head of political economy, Robert McIver, took him in to teach constitutional history in the political science department. Meanwhile, Kennedy was continuing his scholarly productivity with his 1922 book, The Constitution of Canada. It received fabulous reviews and greatly enhanced Kennedy's growing reputation. The British Lord Chancellor, Lord Haldane, called it a remarkable volume. The book was favorably reviewed in the major English papers and journals. The Times called it a work of great accuracy and conspicuous fairness. The Observer, a live, human dramatic. The Law Quarterly Review, an admirable and most readable book. And the New Statesman, a book which will rank high in the literature of political science. Canadian and American reviews were equally positive. No doubt Kennedy was particularly pleased with the review in the Toronto Star Weekly, which compared his book to the discovery of insulin. I cannot go into detail here about Kennedy's views on the British North America Act. In brief, in this first edition, he was a supporter of the Privy Council. Like Lefroy, he agreed with the Privy Council's interpretation, supporting the power of the provinces. This changed over the years, however, following some Privy Council decisions limiting the federal power over peace, order, and good government to serious emergencies. Kennedy slowly took the view that the Privy Council was wrong, particularly when it struck down Canada's New Deal legislation in the 1930s. Much later in his life, however, Kennedy again changed his view after being involved in 1950 with federal provincial conferences on behalf of the government of Ontario. The new taxing power acquired by the federal government, Kennedy now believed, helped balance the powers between the federal government and the provinces. Borel, Askin, who taught us constitutional law, did not, however, change his views on having strong federal power. There were other major accomplishments in those years. In 1923, Kennedy edited an issue of the prestigious American journal, The Annals of Political and Social Science, that had been devoted to Canada. That's Kennedy in 1923, actually reading a copy of the Annals. This was followed up with the editorship of a volume on Canada in the Cambridge series on the history of the British Empire. Both were important projects, and for both projects, he was rubbing shoulders with many influential Canadians. In later years, Kennedy claimed to have played a major role in the drafting of the Irish Constitution of 1922. It is clear that the drafting committee had access to his books, but perhaps not much more. He is not mentioned in any of the books and doctoral studies on the drafting of the Irish Constitution. George Wrong complained to President Faulkner about Kennedy's claim. A few years later, in 1926, constitutional history was given exclusively to the Department of History. This was the very subject Kennedy was then teaching in political economy. What was he to do? Wrong did not want him. Kennedy applied to McGill and other places, again without luck. And again, MacIver came to his rescue. Kennedy would now teach political institutions in the Department of Political Economy and would start a law program in the department. Kennedy and the chair of political economy worked out an honor law program which kept growing. Like the new commerce program, it became a separate department in political economy. Then a department in arts and science. And then in 1941, a separate division in the university outside arts and science. In 1943, Kennedy was given the title dean. Many of the leaders of the bar had been his students, such as Borel, Askin, G. Arthur Martin, and William Howland, later the Chief Justice. They were all fond of Kennedy, who referred to himself as the last character in the university. The law staff kept growing, with mainly Dalhousie graduates who had done postgraduate work at Harvard. A woman, Adelaide MacDonald, who had been one of Kennedy's students, had been hired by Kennedy in the late 1920s, but got married in 1930 and resigned. That if Miss MacDonald had not married, Finkelman might not have been hired, at least at that time. There was a strong multidisciplinary approach to the study of law. Philosophy with Tom Gouge, Steve Gouge's father. Economics with Vincent Blayton. Political theory with Bruff McPherson. The interdisciplinary nature of the school, which it was much like it is at today's law school. Harvard Law School's sociological jurisprudence, or pragmatism, preached by Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes and Benjamin Cardozo, and Harvard Law Dean Roscoe Pound, had a profound influence on the U of T Law School. Because Kennedy did not have a common law background, he was more personally interested in legislation. He was personally more interested in legislation than judicial lawmaking. As a result, he introduced such courses as administrative law, tax law, municipal law, and labor law. Picture of the class of 1936. Kennedy's in the first row in the front. To our right of him is Jacob Finkelman. Just behind the two of them is William Howland. Kennedy was very productive in the 1930s with many books and articles. The University of Toronto Law Journal, still Canada's premier law journal, was founded by him in 1935, and he started a legal studies series for the U of T Press in the 1930s. He also produced an important report for the government on citizenship and was consulted by Parliament on amending the Constitution. And he was instrumental in the drafting of legislation providing for the abolition of appeals to the Privy Council. He also did a series of studies for the Rowell-Sirois Commission in the late 1930s. He had a very productive academic life. There are many stories concerning Kennedy set out in various chapters. There's Kennedy's involvement in a famous plagiarism case brought by Ms. Deeks against Macmillan Publishing and author H.G. Wells. Kennedy was also a major player in an international comparative law conference, the first that had taken place in decades. And there is his discovery of the lost Lord Carleton report, which are led to the Quebec Act of 1774, which permitted French civil law. We also explore the question whether Kennedy supported historian Frank Underhill, whom the board wanted to fire on at least 2 occasions. I argue that Kennedy supported Underhill, although some respected authors say otherwise. There was a continuing struggle with the Law Society of Upper Canada, which did not recognize and gave no credit for the Honor Law BA or even U of T's postgraduate LLB. U of T graduates still needed to take all 3 years at Osgoode. The war years came. One of the professors, Larry Mackenzie, left to become president of the University of New Brunswick. Kennedy wanted to hire Kenneth McAllister, a brilliant graduate who was then at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. McAllister got an offer from Kennedy and wired back, quote, "In army since yesterday, sorry, many thanks, McAllister." The very next day, Borel Askin was offered the position. It always sends a chill down my spine when I talk about McAllister. Askin, as we know, becomes the Chief Justice of Canada. McAllister was dropped behind enemy lines, was captured, tortured, and executed at Buchenwald. The law school became a multicultural institution during the war years, with many West Indian students and a number of women. There were also a number of so-called enemy aliens, mainly German Jews. A particularly interesting story is that of Ivy Lawrence and Peter Fuld. She was a Black student from Trinidad. He was Jewish from a wealthy family in Germany, was interned in England, and then transferred to Canada. Ivy and Peter were in the same law class. They fell in love and wanted to get married. But Peter's mother said she was dead set against it. Each married someone else, but they kept in close touch with each other. Peter recovered his father's factory and died at a young age in 1962, leaving 6 million pounds, the equivalent of 100 million pounds today. Under the will, Ivy was left 15% of the capital to start a law school in the West Indies. There was a 90-day court battle in England. The will was upheld, and she started the Norman Manley Law School in Jamaica. In 1999, she died, leaving $600,000 to the U of T Law School to, quote, be awarded to students from underrepresented minority groups who demonstrate financial need. Now back to the Law Society of Upper Canada. Sidney Smith, a former law teacher, became president of the University of Toronto in 1944. As stated earlier, Askin left the U of T for Osgoode in 1945. Then in 1949, Osgoode's Dean Caesar Wright, along with Borel Askin and John Willis, left Osgoode for U of T. Kennedy retired when Wright arrived in 1949. The law society gave only 1 year's credit to University of Toronto graduates. It was not until 1957 that the U of T program was fully recognized. Students spent an extra year if they went to U of T. The change came in my second year at law school so our class saved the year. On Kennedy's retirement, he more or less stopped writing. He served as an advisor to Premier Leslie Frost in 1950 for a very important series of federal provincial conferences. He was Frost's only outside advisor. After he retired, the University of Toronto gave him an honorary LLD. He's in the back beside the Armed Forces man, and that's Massey in his last role as Chancellor before he becomes Governor General. I can only touch on some of the personal problems Kennedy faced over his career: health, debt, and his family. There were a surprising number of letters to Presidents Faulkner and Cody about his health, including his stomach, his hearing, his sight, his heart, depression, insomnia, internal problems, and his back. Former students later wrote about Kennedy lying on his back on the floor while conducting seminars. He was almost always in debt. Kennedy and Pauline had 2 children, so there were now 4 children. The debt was mainly for medical expenses. There was no health insurance in those years. There were always doctors coming into their house. Kennedy correspondence shows that in the 1930s, Cody sent the equivalent of a year's salary to Kennedy to fend off money lenders. Kennedy died in 1963 at age 84. Not a bad age for someone with all his ailments. He was cremated and buried in a town near the cottage. Pauline was involved in many important public and charitable activities. She was the president of the Women's Canadian Club, head of the Toronto Wartime Prices and Trade Board, one of the founders of the Consumers Association of Canada, and was actively involved in the Canadian Cancer Society. She was an important but now forgotten person. She died in 1967 and was buried beside her husband's ashes in Imsdale, near the cottage. There were 4 children, all now deceased. There are and were no Kennedy great-grandchildren. There's 3 of the children, Freer on the left, Beatrice in the middle, and Sheila on the right. Our dog Tippy below, at around the turn of the century. My conclusion: Kennedy was an excellent scholar and teacher. I'm sure I would have liked him if I had personally known him, in spite of his exaggerated claims and self-centeredness. Kennedy's views on legal education and the importance of research were more or less ignored by Caesar Wright, but later adopted at the law school. So Kennedy, in my view, deserves as much credit for the present law school as Caesar Wright. In the last chapter of the book, I speculate about Kennedy's mental health and state, quote, persons with expertise in mental illness will have their own views about Kennedy's possible personality disorders. I asked the distinguished psychiatrist Mary Seaman for her views about Kennedy's mental health. She read the draft manuscript and tentatively concluded that, quote, he may have no psychiatric condition per se, but a personality disorder characterized by self-aggrandizement and some measure of deceit. Kennedy's disorder, Dr. Seaman went on to say, sounds like hypomania, a not infrequent accompaniment of people who get a lot done, who don't need much sleep, who win over other people, inspire others, and generally insist on things going their way. I think I will leave it at that, and I welcome your comments and questions. Thank you.
So it's Raquel here from the Advancement Office. I'm just flagging for all attendees to please submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get Professor Friedland to answer them. So the first question we have is, what was the most fascinating aspect you learned about Kennedy's life or his influence on U of T law?
Hard to say. I didn't know very much about him. Some of those facts surprised me. The fact that President Cody actually gave a year's salary to Kennedy to get him out of debt. I mean, that certainly raises one's opinion of Cody as a fine person. I was also surprised at how much he had done for various governments. He was instrumental in the abolition of appeals to the Privy Council, bringing the conservatives and the liberals together himself, by his own knowledge of the characters, to support legislation that was eventually upheld by the Privy Council. So his scholarship was greater than I had known, and his book was more important. Harold Lasky, for example, sends it to Felix Frankfurter and says how great the book is. So he was a major scholar. But read the book and you'll see there are lots of interesting things that you didn't know, and I'm not telling you here.
Okay, perfect. Next question is from Brian Livingston from the class of 1980. His question is, what would Kennedy think of the addition of the Charter of Rights to the Canadian Constitution?
Well, that's a good question, as was the last one. There's a paragraph or two there where he was asked by a parliamentary committee in the 40s what his views were on a Bill of Rights. He's on a Charter of Rights, and he rightly said that, and this was his advice to actually Saint-Laurent, who he was apparently friendly with, that they could pass it with respect to federal legislation, which they eventually, Diefenbaker eventually did, but they couldn't do so on when it affected provincial rights. He didn't think at that point that a Bill of Rights was actually necessary. He thought that the courts could find a way of dealing with it. I speculate that, like many people before the Bill of Rights, he wondered whether it was people wondered whether it was necessary, and then came to see how important the Bill of Rights was in Canadian affairs. So I thought that he would have supported it today, even though he didn't support it in the 1940s. Thanks for the question.
Great. So the next question is from former Dean Robert Sharp. He asks, can you tell us more about Kennedy's undergraduate LLB program? What subjects were taught and how much of it would correspond to today's law school's program?
It was very much like today's, thanks for the question, Bob. It's very much like today's law school, torts and contracts, and tax and all of those subjects. And as I mentioned, labor law. It was very, very similar, but they seemed to be able to also cram in all those non-legal subjects, philosophy and economics. He was very keen on economics. The economics department wanted to stop teaching in the law department, and Kennedy said it was absolutely necessary for law students to know some economics. That's why it was odd that the Law Society of Upper Canada didn't give any credit for those subjects that were taught by first-class people.
Great. Okay. The next question is, without Professor Kennedy, would there have been a U of T law school, or did he accelerate an inevitable process?
Yes, I think there would have been a law school, even if Kennedy didn't have that program. It may not have come quite so soon, but it would have come just as Queen's and Western and others established law schools because of the great demand. So we would have had a law school. We had Kennedy's tradition came into the law school through Askin and Labrie and others who continued teaching there. But yeah, a major university like Toronto would have had a law school. All the presidents wanted a law school earlier. If you look at the 1906 Royal Commission on the University of Toronto, they were advocating the establishment of a law school. It's simply that the Law Society wanted the exclusive right to teach students over the years.
Great. Next question is, do you think that Kennedy could get an appointment today at the U of T Faculty of Law?
That's a good question because he doesn't have a law degree. And his doctorate isn't a real doctorate. It's based upon published work. Yes, he wouldn't have gotten an appointment back in the early 20s, but if Kennedy came along at the age of 50 and said he'd like an appointment, I think he'd be hired because of his expertise in constitutional law. Well, I don't know. Be interesting to ask Ed that question. But we have at the law school a wide interest in interdisciplinary work. I don't know. But it's a good question. I'll think more about that. Thank you.
Okay, great. The next question is, I think you said that Miss McDonald worked for Kennedy. Did she teach law? If not, it made me wonder if you know who the first woman to teach at the law school was.
Yes, she did teach law. Hilda McKinley, I believe, who went to the Court of Appeal, was the first person hired, probably by Dean Ronnie MacDonald in the 1960s. And then a number of women were hired in the 1970s, and it kept increasing over the years. The woman that he hired in the 1920s, who got married and left the law school, went on to have a fabulous career, was the most senior woman in the United Nations, and had other distinguished appointments. But she got married, and as many women did at that time, didn't want to pursue her legal career. I don't believe that she went on to, I'm not sure. I don't think she went on to Osgoode at that point. So she was being hired without actually getting her right to practice law. Interesting question.
Okay, next question is, what was the theory behind getting Borel Askin to go to Osgoode with Caesar Wright, with a view to a subsequent plan to go back to U of T?
Yes. Caesar wanted to be at the University of Toronto Law School and to establish it. And he thought if we could take a lot of people with him back, the Law Society would say we should get out of legal education. Laskin was in fact interested in going to Osgoode. He liked Caesar Wright, and he liked the practice of law, and so he was ready to make a move at that time. But he was also very happy to get back to the University of Toronto. But as I said, the Law Society didn't give up legal education. They fortified the existing law school and made it a very strong law school, as it continues to be over the years.
Great. Okay, so one of the last question that we have here is just if you could speak to Kennedy's children, more of their stories.
Okay, thank you for that. Gilbert, the eldest child, became a lawyer, then a professor at UBC, and then the Deputy Attorney General in BC. He had a very good career. The second child, Beatrice, had a very troubled career. She had trouble at school. She went into first year of U of T, but walked out after her first exam. She tried to kill herself and was for a period of time at the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital. Then she tried to kill a member of the family. The records don't show who it was, and was committed to Whitby Mental Hospital, where she stayed for 20 years. Just looking through the records of her career, you could give a history of psychiatry through her case, because she was there for some of the first insulin shock treatments, electroconvulsive therapy, and various other treatments. She later became a housekeeper at Knox College. Freer, the first child with Pauline, also became a lawyer. He went west to get his call to the bar, but didn't like the law and became an Anglican minister. He was apparently a very significant person in his pastoral work, and had I kept in close touch with him over the years, and I think had a very satisfying life. Sheila, the youngest, graduated from the U of T, and went to BC. She worked closely with Harold Innes and Marshall McLuhan on communication theory, and she ended up teaching communication theory as applied to architecture in the BC School of Architecture. And as I say, there were no great-grandchildren. There were 3 grandchildren from Gilbert's family, but no great-grandchildren. So the Kennedy line ran out.
Awesome. Okay, so I just wanted to thank you so much, Professor Friedland, for this sharing this insight into your new book. And I would just want to thank all of the faculties of laws, alumni, students, and friends for participating today. Just note that I'll be sending up a follow-up email with the webinar recording. And then also the link to Professor Friedland's book in the next few days. So I just wanted to thank everyone again and have a lovely rest of your day.
Well, let me thank everyone for joining in on the Zoom session, and thank the law school for organizing it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.